Sarah Martinez looked at herself in the small mirror in the hotel staff room. Her black uniform was clean and pressed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She took a deep breath and walked out into the bright lights of the Grand View. Hotel's main ballroom. The room was like something from a fairy tale. Huge crystal lights hung from the ceiling, making tiny rainbows dance on the white marble floor. Round tables covered with white cloth filled the space. Each table had tall flowers in the center and shiny silver plates that caught the light. Rich people in expensive clothes sat at every table, talking and laughing. Sarah picked up a heavy silver tray filled with glasses of champagne. The glasses were so clean they looked like they were made of air. She walked carefully between the tables, offering drinks to the guests. Most people took a glass without even looking at her. Some said thank you, but many acted like she was invisible. This was the biggest charity event of the year in the city. All the most important people came to this party. There were business owners who ran big companies. There were doctors and lawyers. There were people who owned art galleries and fancy restaurants. They all came dressed in their best clothes to give money to help the city's music group, called the Symphony Orchestra. Sarah knew all about this event because she had worked at the hotel for 3 years. Every year she watched these same people come to eat expensive food and bid on fancy things in an auction. They would spend more money on one painting than Sarah made in a whole year. But tonight was different. Tonight Sarah needed this job. More than ever. Her younger brother Danny was sick. Very sick. He needed special medicine that cost thousands of dollars every month. Their health insurance would not pay for it. Sarah worked 2 jobs to try to save enough money. During the day, she cleaned offices downtown. At night, she worked at the hotel serving at parties like this one. Sarah's feet already hurt from standing all day, but she smiled and kept walking around the room. She knew every face here, even though none of them knew her. There was Mrs. Wellington, the woman who organized this party every year. She was tall and thin with white hair piled high on her head. She wore a long blue dress that probably cost more than Sarah's car. At table 5 sat Dr. Harrison. He was an old man with a white beard who used to teach music at the university. Sarah had read about him in the newspaper. He had taught many famous musicians before he stopped working. Next to him sat his wife, a small woman with kind eyes who always smiled at the waiters. Table 7 had the Chen family. Mr. and Mrs. Chen owned several art galleries in the city. They were always buying paintings and sculptures from young artists. Their daughter Lisa was about Sarah's age. She had just graduated from a fancy college and was starting her own business. Sarah moved to the next table where she saw Judge Morrison and his wife. The judge was a big man with a loud voice who loved to tell stories. His wife was quiet, but always wore beautiful jewelry. Tonight she had on diamond earrings that sparkled like stars. As Sarah walked around offering drinks, she listened to the conversations. The people talked about their recent trips to Europe. They discussed which restaurants they liked best in New York. They compared their children's schools and summer camps. It was a world that Sarah could only imagine. But Sarah was not bitter about their wealth. She knew that these people worked hard for their money. Many of them had started with nothing and built successful businesses. Some had studied for many years to become doctors or lawyers. Others had taken big risks to create something new. Sarah respected that. What made her sad was how they looked at her. Or rather, how they did not look at her. To them, she was just part of the background, like the flowers on the tables or the music playing softly in the corner. They did not see her as a real person with dreams and problems and feelings. Sarah remembered when she was little. Her family had been different. Her father had owned a small business that made parts for computers. They had lived in a nice house with a garden. Sarah had taken piano lessons every week. She had been good at it too. Very good. Her teacher said she had a special gift for music. But when Sarah was 16, her father's business failed. A big company started making the same parts for much less money. Her father could not compete. They lost the house and had to move to a small apartment. There was no money for piano lessons anymore. Sarah had to get a job after school to help pay the bills. She had been accepted to study music at a famous school called Berkeley Conservatory. They had even offered to pay for her classes because she played so well. But when her father got sick and could not work, Sarah had to give up that dream. The family needed her to work and earn money. Now, 8 years later, Sarah was 24 years old and still working to support her family. Her father had died 2 years ago. Her mother worked part-time at a grocery store, but she was getting older and could not work as much as before. Danny was only 15, but his illness meant he could not go to school regularly. Sarah pushed these sad thoughts away and focused on her work. She refilled water glasses and brought fresh bread to the tables. She smiled at the guests and tried to make sure they had everything they needed. This was her job, and she was good at it. The hotel manager, Mr. Thompson, was watching from the corner of the room. He was a strict man who expected perfection from his staff. Sarah knew she had to be careful not to make any mistakes. She needed this job. Her family depended on the money she earned here. As the evening went on, Sarah noticed something that made her heart beat faster. In the corner of the room, on a small stage, sat a beautiful black piano. It was a grand piano, the expensive kind that professional musicians used. The hotel had put it there for the entertainment later in the evening. Sarah tried not to look at the piano too much, but her eyes kept going back to it. She remembered the feeling of her fingers on piano keys. She remembered the joy of making beautiful music. She remembered when music had been the most important thing in her world. But that was a long time ago. Now she was just a waitress carrying drinks to rich people. The piano might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her. Sarah picked up another tray of champagne glasses and continued her work, trying to forget about the music that still lived somewhere deep in her heart. Sarah could not stop looking at the piano. Every time she walked past the stage, her eyes went to the beautiful black instrument sitting there like a sleeping giant. The piano was huge and shiny. Its lid was open, showing the white and black keys that seemed to call to her. Between serving the soup course and clearing the empty bowls, Sarah found herself walking slower when she passed near the stage. She told herself she was just being careful not to bump into other waiters. But she knew the real reason. The piano reminded her of everything she used to love. The guests at the party were getting louder as they drank more wine. Their conversations filled the air with words about money and business and travel. Sarah heard Mrs. Wellington talking about her new house in Florida. At another table, Mr. Chen was describing his latest art purchase, a painting that cost $50,000. The artist is very young, Mr. Chen was saying to the people at his table. Only 25 years old. But his work shows real talent. I believe he will be famous someday. Sarah refilled his water glass and wondered what it would be like to have someone believe in your talent that much. To have someone willing to spend so much money because they thought you were special. At table 3, Dr. Harrison was telling a story about his days teaching music. I had one student, he said, cutting his roast beef with careful movements. She was maybe 19 years old, the most natural talent I had ever seen. She could play anything after hearing it just once. But she disappeared after one semester. Never came back. I always wondered what happened to her. Sarah's hand shook a little as she poured wine into Dr. Harrison's glass. She wondered how many talented people had to give up their dreams because life got in the way. How many musicians were out there working regular jobs, their music locked away inside them. Talent is not enough, said Mrs. Harrison, Dr. Harrison's wife. You need opportunity too, and luck, and support from family. Sarah thought about her own family as she moved to the next table. Her mother tried to be supportive, but she was too worried about paying bills to think about music. Danny was too young and too sick to understand what Sarah had given up. Her father had never really understood why piano lessons were important. Anyway, the main course was almost finished when Sarah noticed something happening on the stage. A man in an expensive black suit was checking the piano. He opened and closed the lid. He pressed a few keys, listening carefully to the sound. This must be the famous pianist who was supposed to play for the guests tonight. Sarah had heard the other waiters talking about him. His name was Victor Petrov, and he was very famous. He had played with orchestras all over the world. People paid hundreds of dollars just to hear him play. Tonight, he was donating his time to help raise money for the local symphony orchestra. Sarah watched as Victor adjusted the piano bench and tested the pedals with his feet. Even from across the room, she could see that he knew exactly what he was doing. Every movement was confident and professional. This was a man who had spent his whole life with music. Victor was about 50 years old with gray hair and serious eyes. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look very smart. Sarah could see expensive cufflinks on his shirt and a watch that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. This was what success in music looked like. A's, Sarah cleared dessert. Plates from the tables, she listened to the guests talking about Victor. They were excited to hear him play. Many of them had heard him before at other concerts. "He played at Carnegie Hall last month," said Judge Morrison to his wife. The newspaper said it was the best performance they had heard all year. "I remember when he was young," said Mrs. Wellington. "Even then you could tell he was special. Some people are just born with a gift." Sarah wondered if she had been born with a gift too. Her old piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, used to say she had never heard a child play with so much feeling. "Music comes from your heart, not just your fingers," Mrs. Rodriguez would say. "And your heart sings, Sarah." But that was years ago. Sarah had not touched a piano in so long that she wondered if she could still play. Maybe she had forgotten how. Maybe the music in her heart had died from neglect, like a plant without water. The dessert course was finished, and the waiters began clearing all the dishes from the tables. Sarah carried heavy trays back to the kitchen, where the dishwashers were working hard to keep up with all the dirty plates and glasses. "Big crowd tonight," said Maria, another waitress who had been working at the hotel longer than Sarah. "These rich people sure know how to eat." Sarah nodded but did not really want to talk. Her mind was still on the piano and the memories it brought back. She remembered her first recital when she was 8 years old. She had worn a white dress with ribbons in her hair. Her parents sat in the front row, smiling and clapping when she finished playing Dot. She remembered staying after school to practice when other kids were playing outside. She remembered the feeling of learning a new piece and finally getting all the notes right. She remembered the dreams she used to have about playing in big concert halls with thousands of people listening. "Earth to Sarah," said Maria, snapping her fingers. "Mr. Thompson wants all the coffee ready before the music starts." Sarah shook her head to clear her thoughts and got back to work. She helped prepare dozens of cups of coffee and tea for the guests. The kitchen was hot and busy with everyone rushing to get everything ready for the final part of the evening. When Sarah returned to the ballroom with her tray of coffee, she saw that the lights had been dimmed. Spotlights now shone on the stage where Victor was sitting at the piano. The guests had turned their chairs to face the stage, and the room was quieter than it had been all evening. Sarah stood at the back of the room with the other waiters, ready to serve coffee when the music was over. She had a perfect view of the piano and the man who was about to play it. Victor placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The music that came from the piano was beautiful and sad and powerful all at the same time. Sarah recognized the piece. It was a nocturne by Chopin, one of her favorite composers. As Victor played, Sarah felt something stirring inside her chest. It was like a bird that had been sleeping for a long time and was just beginning to wake up. The music seemed to speak directly to her soul, reminding her of who she used to be before life got in the way. She watched Victor's hands move across the keys with perfect control. She saw how he used his whole body to create the music, not just his fingers. She noticed how he closed his eyes during the most emotional parts, letting the music flow through him. Sarah found herself moving her own fingers slightly, as if she were playing along with Victor. The muscle memory was still there, even after all these years. Her fingers remembered where to go, even though they had not touched piano keys in so long. The guests were completely silent, caught up in the beauty of the music. Sarah saw Mrs. Wellington wipe a tear from her eye. Dr. Harrison was nodding his head in time with the melody. Even the other waiters had stopped moving to listen. When Victor finished the piece, the room exploded in applause. The guests stood up and clapped for a long time. Victor smiled and bowed, then sat down to play another piece. Sarah remained at the back of the room, watching and listening and remembering. With each note that Victor played, she felt the music in her own heart, growing stronger. The sleeping bird was stretching its wings, getting ready to fly again. Victor was halfway through his second piece when something went wrong. Sarah noticed it first because she was watching him so carefully. His left hand stumbled on a chord that should have been easy for someone of his skill. She saw him shake, his head slightly as if trying to clear his vision. The music continued, but something was different. Victor's usually perfect timing seemed off. His breathing looked labored. Sarah frowned and stepped forward slightly, concerned by what she was seeing. Most of the guests did not notice anything unusual. They were not musicians, so small mistakes meant nothing to them. They continued to listen with polite smiles, enjoying their coffee and the elegant atmosphere of the evening. But Dr. Harrison noticed. Sarah saw the old music professor lean forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on Victor with growing concern. Dr. Harrison had trained enough pianists to know when something was seriously wrong. Victor struggled through the end of the piece, but his playing was getting weaker with each measure. When he finished, the applause was just as loud as before. But Sarah could see sweat on Victor's forehead despite the cool air conditioning in the ballroom. Victor stood up from the piano bench to bow, but instead of his usual confident movement, he swayed slightly. He grabbed the edge of the piano to steady himself. Sarah saw his face go pale, and she knew that something terrible was about to happen. "Is he okay?" whispered Maria, who had moved up beside Sarah to watch the performance. Before Sarah could answer, Victor suddenly pressed his hand against his chest. His eyes went wide with pain and fear. He tried to say something, but no words came out. Then, like a tree falling in slow motion, Victor collapsed onto the stage. For a moment, the entire ballroom was silent. No one seemed to understand what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. Guests began screaming and jumping up from their chairs. Some people rushed toward the stage while others backed away in fear. "Call 911, shouted Dr. Harrison, who was already climbing onto the stage. His wife was right behind him, pulling out her cell phone. Sarah ran forward without thinking. Her job training had taught her basic first aid, and she could see that Victor was unconscious and struggling to breathe. She knelt beside Dr. Harrison as he checked Victor's pulse. "Heart attack," Dr. Harrison said grimly. "We need paramedics here now." Mrs. Wellington was running around the ballroom like a chicken with its head cut off. Her carefully planned evening was falling apart before her eyes. She kept saying, "What do we do? What do we do?" Over and over again. The hotel manager, Mr. Thompson, appeared on the stage. He was trying to stay calm, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a loud voice, "please remain calm. Medical help is on the way." But the guests were not calm. Some were gathering their purses and coats, ready to leave. Others were crowding around the stage trying to see what was happening. The beautiful, elegant atmosphere of the evening had been shattered in an instant. Sarah stayed beside Victor, helping Dr. Harrison keep him comfortable until the paramedics arrived. Victor's breathing was shallow, and his skin was cold and clammy. Sarah had never been this close to someone having a heart attack, and it scared her. The ambulance crew arrived within 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. They quickly loaded Victor onto a stretcher and rushed him out of the ballroom. Dr. Harrison went with them, leaving his wife to explain to the other guests what had happened. After the ambulance left, the ballroom felt empty and sad despite being full of people. The magic of the evening was gone. Guests stood around in small groups, talking quietly about what they had witnessed. Some were already leaving, but others seemed unsure of what to do. Mrs. Wellington stood near the stage, looking lost and confused. This charity event was the most important night of the year for the symphony orchestra. They depended on the money raised tonight to keep operating. Without the full program of entertainment, would people still donate generously? Sarah watched Mrs. Wellington pull out her phone and start making frantic calls. She was trying to find another pianist who could come immediately to save the evening. But it was Saturday night and most professional musicians were already performing somewhere else. "No, he's already booked," Sarah heard Mrs. Wellington say into her phone. "What about Rebecca Martinez?" "No. What do you mean she's in Europe?" Mrs. Wellington tried call after call, but every pianist she contacted was either unavailable or too far away to help. The clock on the wall showed that it was already 9:30. The auction was supposed to start at 10, but people needed to be in a good mood to bid high prices. Without music to keep the elegant atmosphere going, the evening might be a financial disaster. Some guests were starting to leave. Sarah saw Judge Morrison and his wife gathering their things. "Such a shame," Judge Morrison was saying. "Victor is a good man. I hope he'll be all right." "Should we stay for the auction?" asked his wife. Judge Morrison looked around the half-empty ballroom. "I don't think there's going to be much of an auction now. People are too upset." Sarah felt sorry for Mrs. Wellington, who was still desperately trying to find a replacement pianist. She knew how much work had gone into organizing this event. Months of planning and preparation were about to be wasted because of one terrible moment. "What about the music students at the university?" Mrs. Wellington was asking someone on the phone. Surely one of them could play something simple. But even the music students were not available on such short notice. It was Saturday night, and most of them had their own plans. Besides, Mrs. Wellington explained to her assistant, they needed someone who could play the kind of sophisticated music that would appeal to this wealthy crowd. Sarah continued to clear empty coffee cups from the tables, but her mind was racing. She kept thinking about Victor lying unconscious on the stretcher. She thought about Mrs. Wellington's growing desperation. She thought about the symphony orchestra that might not get the money it needed to survive. Most of all, she thought about the piano sitting silent on the stage. It seemed to be waiting for someone to bring it back to life. The spotlight was still shining on it, but now it looked lonely and abandoned. "This is a disaster," Maria whispered to Sarah as they worked together to stack dirty dishes. "Mrs. Wellington looks like she's about to cry." Sarah looked over at the event organizer, who was ending another unsuccessful phone call. Mrs. Wellington's face was red with stress, and her carefully styled hair was starting to come undone. She looked like a woman who was watching her life's work crumble around her. The guests who remained were getting restless. They had come for an elegant evening of music and charity, not to witness a medical emergency. The energy in the room was all wrong for an auction where people were expected to spend thousands of dollars on donated items. "Maybe we should just cancel the rest of the evening," Sarah heard Mrs. Wellington say to her assistant. "Send everyone home and try again next year." But canceling would be almost as bad as having a failed auction. The symphony orchestra needed this money now, not next year. Sarah knew from reading the local newspaper that the orchestra was already in financial trouble. Without a successful fundraiser tonight, they might have to cancel their entire next season. Sarah finished loading her tray with dirty dishes and headed back toward the kitchen. As she passed the stage, she stopped and looked at the piano one more time. Its keys seemed to gleam in the spotlight, waiting for hands that might never come. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of the ambulance siren fading away as it carried Victor to the hospital. She said a silent prayer that he would be okay. But she also found herself thinking about the piano and about music and about dreams that sometimes get a second chance when you least expect it. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway watching Mrs. Wellington make one last desperate phone call. The woman's voice was getting higher with each failed attempt to find a pianist. Sarah's heart pounded as she listened to the conversation. "Please, I'm begging you," Mrs. Wellington was saying. "Even a student would be better than nothing. The donors are starting to leave and we need something to save this evening." The person on the other end must have said no again, because Mrs. Wellington's shoulders slumped in defeat. She hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, looking lost and beaten. Sarah's hands were shaking as she set down her tray of dirty dishes. Her mind was racing with thoughts she had been trying to push away all evening. The piano on the stage was calling to her, but she was just a waitress. Who was she to think she could help in a situation like this? But then Sarah thought about Danny lying in his hospital bed last week, too weak from his illness to get up. She thought about the medical bills piling up on their kitchen table at home. She thought about her mother working extra hours at the grocery store, her feet swollen and painful at the end of each day. More than anything, she thought about the music that had been locked away in her heart for so many years. Victor's performance had awakened something inside her that she had tried to forget. The melodies were still there, waiting to be set free. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward Mrs. Wellington. Her legs felt weak, and her mouth was dry with fear. She had never done anything this bold in her entire life. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wellington," Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Wellington looked up with tired, red eyes. Not now, dear. I'm dealing with a crisis here. I know, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I can play piano. Mrs. Wellington stared at her as if she had said she could fly to the moon. I'm sorry, what did you say? I can play piano, Sarah repeated, a little louder this time. I used to study music before I had to stop. I know it sounds crazy, but I could try to help. Mrs. Wellington looked Sarah up and down, taking in her black waitress uniform and her nervous expression. You're a waitress, she said, as if this explained everything. Yes, but I used to play piano. I was pretty good at it. Sarah's voice got stronger as she continued. I know it's not the same as having a professional like Mr. Petrov, but maybe I could play some background music to keep people from leaving. Mrs. Wellington shook her head. This is not a coffee shop, dear. These people expect quality. They're used to hearing world-class musicians, not hotel staff trying to play piano. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment, but she did not give up. I understand, but what other choice do you have? Maybe it would be better than no music at all. Mrs. Wellington was about to say no again when her assistant rushed over with more bad news. I just called the music department at the community college, the assistant said breathlessly. They don't have anyone available either, and 3 more couples just left for home. Mrs. Wellington looked around the ballroom at the remaining guests. Many of them were checking their watches and gathering their belongings. The auction was supposed to start in 20 minutes, but without something to change the mood, it would be a complete failure. What exactly can you play? Mrs. Wellington asked Sarah with little hope in her voice. Sarah, quote, S' mind raced through all the pieces she used to know. Classical music mostly. Bach, Chopin, Debussy, Mozart. Some modern pieces too. I haven't played in a while, but I think I still remember most of it. Mrs. Wellington looked skeptical. These are not simple songs, dear. They require years of training and practice. I know, Sarah said. I had 8 years of lessons before I had to stop. I was accepted to study at Berklee Conservatory, but I couldn't go because of family problems. This information made Mrs. Wellington pause. Berklee Conservatory was one of the most famous music schools in the country. They did not accept students who could not play well. Dr. Harrison's wife, Mrs. Harrison, had overheard the conversation and walked over to them. Did you say Berklee Conservatory? She asked Sarah. Sarah nodded, feeling embarrassed to admit her failed dream to a stranger. My husband taught there for 30 years, Mrs. Harrison said. They only accept about 5% of the students who apply. If they wanted you, you must have been very talented. Mrs. Wellington looked back and forth between Sarah and Mrs. Harrison. But that was years ago. She probably can't even remember how to play anymore. There's only one way to find out, said Mrs. Harrison gently. Why don't we let her try? What's the worst that could happen? Mrs. Wellington looked around the ballroom again. More guests were leaving every minute. The beautiful charity event that she had worked on for months was falling apart. She was running out of options. I suppose we have nothing to lose at this point, Mrs. Wellington said with a heavy sigh. But if you embarrass me in front of these people, you'll never work in this hotel again. Sarah felt her knees go weak at the threat, but she nodded. I understand. I'll do my best. Mrs. Wellington led Sarah toward the stage, shaking her head as if she could not believe what she was doing. Just play something quiet and simple, she instructed. Background music to keep people from leaving. Don't try to be fancy. As they walked across the ballroom, Sarah noticed that people were watching them with curious expressions. They probably wondered why a waitress was walking toward the piano with the event organizer. Sarah, quote, S' heart was beating so fast she thought it might explode. Her hands were sweating and she felt dizzy with fear. What if she had forgotten how to play? What if she made a fool of herself in front of all these important people? What if Mrs. Wellington fired her and she lost the job her family desperately needed? But as they got closer to the piano, Sarah felt something else besides fear. She felt excitement. For the first time in 8 years, she was about to sit at a real piano and make music again. The thought made her feel alive in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. They reached the stage, and Mrs. Wellington gestured toward the piano bench. "Well," she said, "let's see what you can do." Sarah climbed the steps to the stage on shaking legs. The spotlight was bright and hot on her face. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her as she walked toward the piano. Some guests had stopped their conversations to see what was happening. Sarah sat down on the piano bench and looked at the keys. They were so beautiful and perfect, like old friends she had not seen in years. She adjusted the bench to the right height and put her feet on the pedals, just like her teacher had taught her long ago. She looked out at the audience and saw Mrs. Wellington standing with her arms crossed, waiting to see if her crazy gamble would pay off. She saw Mrs. Harrison smiling encouragingly. She saw Dr. Harrison, who had returned from the hospital, watching with professional interest. Sarah placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it. This was her chance to let the music out of her heart where it had been trapped for so long. She closed her eyes and began to play. Sarah's fingers trembled as they touched the piano keys for the first time in 8 years. The keys felt cool and smooth under her fingertips, familiar, yet foreign after so much time away. For a moment she wondered if her hands would remember what to do. She started with something simple and safe. Clair de Lune by Debussy. It was one of the first advanced pieces she had learned as a teenager, and the melody was burned into her memory. Her left hand found the opening notes while her right hand joined in with the beautiful flowing theme. At first, her playing was careful and uncertain. Her fingers felt stiff, and she had to think about each note instead of letting the music flow naturally. Sarah was terribly aware of all the people watching her. She could feel their doubt and skepticism like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Mrs. Wellington stood at the edge of the stage, with her arms still crossed, her face showing polite patience rather than any real hope. A few guests had stopped, their conversations to listen, but most continued talking in low voices, paying little attention to the waitress who thought she could play piano. But as Sarah continued playing, something magical began to happen. Her muscles started to remember movements they had practiced thousands of times years ago. Her fingers began to relax and find their way across the keys more easily. The music that had been locked away in her heart for so long started to seep out note by note. The melody of Clair de Lune is like moonlight on water, soft, gentle, and mysterious. As Sarah played, she forgot about the audience and lost herself in the beauty of the music. Her fear began to melt away, replaced by the pure joy of making music again. Mrs. Chen was the first to really notice. She had been talking to her husband about buying a sculpture for their art gallery, but the piano music made her stop mid-sentence. She turned toward the stage with a surprised look on her face. "That's quite good," Mr. Chen whispered to his wife. "Much better than I expected." Dr. Harrison, who had just returned from the hospital with news that Victor was stable, moved closer to the stage. His trained ear could hear something special happening. The waitress was not just playing the notes correctly, she was making real music. As Sarah reached the middle section of the piece, her confidence grew stronger, her touch became more expressive, and she began to use the pedals to create richer, more beautiful sounds. The piano seemed to respond to her like an old friend who was happy to see her again. More guests began to notice the music. Conversations grew quieter as people turned their attention to the stage. Judge Morrison, who had been putting on his coat to leave, paused and listened with growing amazement. "Martha," he whispered to his wife, "listen to this." Sarah was completely absorbed in the music now. She swayed slightly as she played, her whole body moving with the rhythm and emotion of the piece. Her eyes were closed, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like herself again. Mrs. Wellington's expression was changing from skepticism to surprise to something approaching wonder. She had expected amateur playing at best, but what she was hearing was far beyond that. This young woman could really play. When Sarah finished Clair de Lune, there was a moment of perfect silence in the ballroom. Then slowly, applause began. It was not the polite clapping of people being nice to a waitress who tried her best. It was genuine appreciation for beautiful music. Sarah opened her eyes and looked out at the audience. She was surprised to see that most of the guests were now facing the stage and paying attention. Their expressions had changed from polite boredom to real interest. "Play something else," called out Mrs. Harrison from her table. "That was beautiful." Sarah looked at Mrs. Wellington, who nodded with amazement. "Yes," Mrs. Wellington said. "Please, continue." Sarah thought for a moment about what to play next. She wanted something that would keep people's attention but not overwhelm them. She decided on a nocturne by Chopin, romantic and emotional but not too difficult for her rusty technique. As she began the new piece, Sarah felt her confidence soar. The Chopin nocturne was more challenging than the Debussy, requiring faster fingerwork and more complex emotions. But Sarah's hands were warming up now, and her muscle memory was fully awakened. The music flowed from the piano like water from a spring. Sarah's left hand played a gentle accompaniment, while her right hand sang the beautiful melody. She used subtle changes in volume and timing to make the music breathe and live. Dr. Harrison moved even closer to the stage, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had heard thousands of students play over his career, and he knew exceptional talent when he heard it. This waitress was not just competent, she was genuinely gifted. More guests were putting down their coffee cups and wine glasses to listen properly. The background chatter that had filled the ballroom all evening gradually faded away. Even the other waiters and hotel staff had stopped working to listen. Sarah felt the change in the room's energy, and it inspired her to play even better. She added small decorations to the melody, little touches that showed her musical intelligence and creativity. The piano sang under her hands like a bird that had been set free from its cage. Mrs. Wellington stood transfixed, hardly able to believe what was happening. She had organized charity events for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. A waitress was transforming her disaster of an evening into something magical. Judge Morrison had taken off his coat and sat back down. His wife reached over and squeezed his hand, both of them moved by the unexpected beauty of the music. "Where did she learn to play like that?" Mrs. Chen whispered to her husband. "I don't know," he replied, "but she's remarkable." As Sarah played, she felt years of frustration and sadness flowing out through her fingers. All the dreams she had given up, all the music she had kept locked inside, all the nights she had fallen asleep humming melodies she could not play. It was all pouring out now in a stream of beautiful sound. The Chopin nocturne built to an emotional climax, and Sarah played it with such feeling that several people in the audience had tears in their eyes. She was not just playing notes on a page, she was telling a story with music, painting pictures with sound. When the piece ended, the applause was longer and louder than before. People were looking at each other with amazement, wondering who this mysterious waitress was and where she had learned to play so beautifully. Sarah sat at the piano bench, breathing hard and feeling more alive than she had in years. The music was flowing through her like electricity, waking up parts of her soul that had been sleeping for too long. "Play more," someone called from the audience. "Yes, don't stop," said another voice. Sarah looked at Mrs. Wellington, who was now smiling broadly. The event organizer nodded enthusiastically and gestured for her to continue. Sarah turned back to the piano, her heart racing with excitement and joy. She had almost forgotten how much she loved this feeling, the feeling of sharing music with other people and watching it touch their hearts. She placed her hands on the keys again, ready to play something even more challenging. Sarah decided to take a bigger risk with her third piece. She had been playing it safe with gentle, well-known works, but now she felt brave enough to try something more demanding. She chose Chopin's Ballade No. 1 a piece that required not just technical skill but deep musical understanding. As soon as she played the opening notes, Dr. Harrison sat up straighter in his chair. The Ballade was one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. It was not something that an amateur could play convincingly. If this waitress could handle it properly, she was far more than she appeared to be. Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. The Ballade told a story, sometimes gentle and dreamy, sometimes passionate and stormy. Sarah knew this piece by heart from her conservatory audition years ago. It had been her signature piece, the one that had earned her that scholarship she never got to use. Mrs. Chen pulled out her cell phone and began recording. She had a feeling she was witnessing something extraordinary, and she wanted to capture it. Around the room, other guests were doing the same thing. Word was already spreading on social media that something amazing was happening at the Grandview Hotel. The music grew more complex as Sarah moved through the different sections of the ballade. Her left hand played intricate bass lines while her right hand danced through difficult passages that would challenge even professional pianists. But Sarah played them with ease, as if she had been practicing every day for the past 8 years instead of serving coffee and clearing tables. Dr. Harrison leaned over to his wife. "This is impossible," he whispered. "She's playing at a conservatory level. Where has she been hiding all this time?" Mrs. Harrison shook her head in wonder. "I have no idea, but we need to find out. This girl is special." The guests were completely silent now, hanging on every note. Even the hotel staff had gathered at the edges of the ballroom to listen. Mr. Thompson, the hotel manager, stood with his mouth open, unable to believe that one of his waitresses possessed such extraordinary talent. Sarah was lost in the music, her whole body moving with the rhythm and emotion of the piece. The ballade allowed her to show every aspect of her musical personality, the gentle, lyrical side and the powerful, dramatic side. It was like finally being able to speak after years of forced silence. As she played, Sarah thought about all the things that had led her to this moment. Her father's failed business, her family's financial struggles, her brother's illness, her own sacrifice of giving up music school. All of those painful experiences had shaped her, and now they were flowing out through her fingers in the form of this beautiful, heartbreaking music. Mrs. Wellington was practically glowing with excitement. She had gone from disaster to triumph in the space of 20 minutes. The guests who had been ready to leave were now completely captivated. Some were even calling friends to come join them. This was turning into the most memorable charity event in the hotel's history. "I need to know everything about her," Mrs. Wellington whispered to her assistant. "Her background, her training, everything." The assistant was already taking notes on her tablet. She had never seen Mrs. Wellington this excited about anything. Judge Morrison was shaking his head in amazement. "I've been to Carnegie Hall dozens of times," he told his wife, "and I've rarely heard playing this good. How is a waitress at the Grandview Hotel able to play like this?" His wife was recording on her phone too. "I don't know, but we need to help her somehow. Talent like this shouldn't be wasted serving coffee." Dr. Harrison was studying Sarah's technique with professional interest. Her hand position was perfect, her pedaling was sophisticated, and her musical interpretation was mature and thoughtful. This was not someone who had learned to play as a hobby. This was someone who had received serious high-level training. The ballad reached its dramatic climax, and Sarah threw herself into it with passion and power. Her hands flew across the keys in passages that sounded almost impossible to play. The piano rang out with rich, full chords that filled every corner of the ballroom. Several guests had tears streaming down their faces. The music was so beautiful and so unexpected that it felt like a miracle. Mrs. Chen was openly crying as she continued to record, thinking about all the struggling artists she had met who would never get a chance like this. Sarah played the final gentle section of the ballade with exquisite tenderness. After all the drama and passion, the piece ended quietly, like a whispered secret. When the last note faded away, the ballroom was completely silent for several long seconds. Then the applause exploded. It was not polite charity event clapping. It was the kind of enthusiastic, emotional response usually reserved for world-famous performers. People jumped to their feet, cheering and shouting their approval. Dr. Harrison was the first to stand, applauding with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Harrison joined him, then the Chens, then Judge Morrison and his wife. Within moments, every single person in the ballroom was on their feet, giving Sarah a standing ovation. Sarah sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had dreamed of moments like this when she was younger, but she had never imagined it would actually happen. The sound of the applause washed over her like warm sunshine after a long, cold winter. Mrs. Wellington rushed onto the stage, her face beaming with joy and excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced over the continuing applause, "I think we can all agree that we have just witnessed something truly extraordinary." The applause grew even louder. People were calling out bravo and more. Some were wiping their eyes with their napkins. Dr. Harrison pushed through the crowd to get closer to the stage. He needed to talk to this remarkable young woman. As someone who had spent his life teaching music, he recognized rare talent when he heard it. Sarah was not just good. She was exceptional. Mrs. Chen was already thinking about the arts organization she was connected with. This waitress needed to be performing on professional stages, not carrying trays in hotel ballrooms. Mrs. Chen had helped launch the careers of several young artists, and she was ready to do it again. Judge Morrison was thinking about his connections in the business community. If this young woman needed financial support to pursue her musical career, he knew people who would be interested in helping. Sarah finally stood up from the piano bench and curtsied slightly, the way her first piano teacher had taught her to do after performing. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Mrs. Wellington raised her hand for quiet. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we would love to hear more. Sarah, would you be willing to play another piece?" Sarah looked out at all the faces watching her with such warmth and appreciation. These were the same people who had treated her as invisible all evening, but now they were looking at her like she was the most important person in the room. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I would be happy to play more." The crowd settled back into their seats, buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Sarah sat back down at the piano, feeling like she was living in a dream. She had spent 8 years hiding her talent, convinced that her musical dreams were over forever. But now, in front of this audience of wealthy and influential people, she was finally able to show the world who she really was. And they were listening. For her final piece, Sarah chose something that would show everything she could do as a musician. She decided on the opening movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most famous and challenging pieces ever written for piano. Without an orchestra to accompany her, she would have to play both the piano part and suggest the orchestral parts. An incredibly difficult task. As soon as Sarah played the opening chords, a hush fell over the entire ballroom. The Rachmaninoff Concerto was known to music lovers around the world. It was the kind of piece that only master pianists attempted in public. For a waitress to even try it was either very brave or very foolish. But from the first notes, it was clear that Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands moved across the keys with complete confidence, playing the famous melody that had moved audiences for over a century. The music was romantic and powerful, requiring both delicate touch and thunderous strength. Dr. Harrison gripped his wife's hand as he listened. He had heard this concerto performed by some of the world's greatest pianists, and Sarah's interpretation was holding its own against any of them. Her technical skill was flawless, but more importantly, she understood the emotional heart of the music. Mrs. Chen stopped recording on her phone because her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. She had spent her life around artists and art, but she had never seen raw talent like this discovered in such an unexpected place. This was the kind of story that people would talk about for years. The hotel staff who had gathered to listen were stunned into silence. Maria, the other waitress who had worked alongside Sarah for months, could hardly believe what she was seeing. She had known Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, but she had never imagined anything like this. Mr. Thompson, the hotel manager, was already thinking about how to handle the media attention this would surely bring. Videos of Sarah's performance were probably already spreading on social media. By tomorrow, the whole world might know about the waitress at the Grandview Hotel, who could play like an angel. Sarah played through the concerto's most difficult passages without a single mistake. Her left hand thundered through complex bass lines while her right hand sang the beautiful melodies. She used the piano's full range, from the deepest bass notes to the highest treble, creating sounds that filled the ballroom with rich, orchestral textures. Judge Morrison had heard this concerto at Symphony Hall just last month, performed by a famous Russian pianist. But somehow hearing it played by this young woman in a hotel ballroom felt even more magical. There was something pure and honest about her playing that touched his heart in a way the professional performance had not. Mrs. Wellington stood at the side of the stage, tears streaming down her face. She had organized hundreds of events over the years, but nothing had ever moved her like this. The evening that had started as a potential disaster was turning into the most beautiful night of her professional life. As Sarah moved through the different sections of the concerto, she seemed to grow more confident and powerful. The music demanded everything from her: speed, strength, delicacy, passion. And she delivered it all with grace and maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. Dr. Harrison was making mental notes about Sarah's technique and interpretation. She was playing with the sophistication of someone who had studied at the highest levels and performed regularly. But according to what she had told Mrs. Wellington, she had not touched a piano in 8 years. It was almost unbelievable. The concerto built to its dramatic climax, and Sarah threw her whole body into the music. Her hair came loose from its neat bun and fell around her shoulders as she played. Her waitress uniform was forgotten. She was no longer serving others, but serving the music itself. Some of the guests were openly weeping as they listened. The combination of the beautiful music and the incredible story of its performer was overwhelming. Here was a young woman who had sacrificed her dreams to take care of her family, and now her talent was shining so brightly that it could not be hidden any longer. Mrs. Chen was already planning how she could help Sarah. She knew directors of several music festivals who would be thrilled to have a performer with this kind of ability and compelling story. She knew agents who could help Sarah start a professional career. Most importantly, she knew wealthy patrons who would be happy to provide financial support. The concerto movement finally came to its triumphant conclusion. Sarah played the final chords with such power and emotion that the piano seemed to shake. When the last note rang out and faded away, the ballroom was completely silent for a long moment. Then, as if a dam had burst, the entire room exploded in applause. But this was not ordinary applause. This was the kind of ovation usually reserved for legendary performers at the world's greatest concert halls. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, shouting, and whistling with pure joy. Every single person in the ballroom rose to their feet. Dr. Harrison was applauding so hard, his hands hurt. Mrs. Harrison was sobbing with happiness. Judge Morrison was shouting "Bravo" at the top of his voice. Mrs. Chen was jumping up and down like a teenager at a rock concert. The hotel staff joined in the ovation, clapping and cheering for their colleague who had just revealed herself to be extraordinary. Mr. Thompson was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, proud and amazed that such talent had been working in his hotel all along. The applause went on, showing no signs of stopping. Sarah stood at the piano, completely overwhelmed by the response. She had never experienced anything like this. The pure love and appreciation flowing from an audience that had been moved to the depths of their souls. Mrs. Wellington climbed onto the stage and took Sarah's hand, raising it above their heads, like a prize fighter who had just won the championship. The crowd cheered even louder if that was possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Wellington shouted over the continuing applause, "I present to you Miss Sarah Martinez, the most extraordinary discovery of our time." The ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes. People were calling out requests for more music, but Sarah was too emotional to play another note. She stood there holding Mrs. Wellington's hand, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding what it felt like to be recognized for who she truly was. Dr. Harrison was already pushing through the crowd, determined to reach the stage and talk to Sarah about her future. Mrs. Chen was right behind him, her mind racing with possibilities for launching Sarah's professional career. As the applause finally began to die down, Sarah looked out at all the faces watching her with such love and respect. These were the same people who had barely noticed her existence a few hours earlier. But music had the power to transform everything, not just the listeners but the performer as well. Sarah realized that her life had just changed forever. There would be no going back to invisibility after tonight. The music had set her free, and now the whole world would know what she could do. The standing ovation had lasted longer than some entire classical concerts. It was a moment that everyone in the ballroom would remember for the rest of their lives. The night they discovered that miracles could happen in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken hearts. The charity auction that followed Sarah's performance was unlike any fundraiser the Grandview Hotel had ever hosted. The guests were so inspired by what they had witnessed that they bid with unprecedented generosity. Items that normally sold for hundreds of dollars were going for thousands. The final total was 3 times higher than any previous year. Mrs. Wellington could hardly contain her excitement as she announced the record-breaking results. "Thanks to our amazing discovery, tonight," she said, gesturing toward Sarah, "we have raised enough money to fund the symphony orchestra for the next 3 years." The crowd erupted in cheers again. Sarah sat at a table near the stage, still wearing her waitress uniform but no longer feeling like she belonged in it. Everything had changed in the space of 2 hours. Dr. Harrison was the first to approach her when the formal program ended. He sat down across from Sarah with a warm smile and kind eyes. "My dear," he said gently, "we need to talk about your future." Sarah looked at the distinguished old professor, hardly able to believe he was speaking to her as an equal. "I'm sorry about lying earlier," she said quietly. "I wasn't really a student at Berkeley, I was just accepted there." Dr. Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "I know exactly who you are now. I made some phone calls during the auction. You were Sarah Martinez, the scholarship winner from 8 years ago. Your teachers at the preparatory school still talk about you. They said you simply disappeared one day and never came back." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. "My family needed me to work. We lost everything when my father's business failed." "There's no shame in taking care of your family," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "But there would be a terrible shame in wasting the gift you've just shown us tonight." Mrs. Chen joined them at the table, her eyes bright with excitement. "Sarah, I've been on the phone with some very important people. The director of the Metropolitan Chamber Music Festival wants to meet you. The Lincoln Center has an emerging artist program that would be perfect for you." Sarah felt overwhelmed by all the attention. "But I haven't performed in 8 years. I'm not ready for anything like that." "You were ready enough tonight," Judge Morrison said as he and his wife approached the table. "My wife and I want to help. We've decided to establish a scholarship fund in your name to help other young musicians who face financial hardships." Mrs. Morrison smiled warmly at Sarah. "But first we want to help you. Your brother's medical bills, your family's expenses. Let us take care of those things so you can focus on your music." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I can't accept that. It's too much." "It's not enough," Dr. Harrison said seriously. "Sarah, what you did tonight was extraordinary, but it was also just the beginning. You have a responsibility to share your gift with the world." Mrs. Wellington joined the growing group around Sarah's table. "The hotel would be honored to have you perform here regularly," she said. "We could arrange monthly concerts. It would give you performance experience while you prepare for bigger opportunities." Sarah looked around at all these successful, influential people who were suddenly treating her like family. She thought about Danny waiting at home, about her mother working late at the grocery store, about all the dreams she had put aside. "I don't know how to thank you all," Sarah said through her tears. "Don't thank us yet," Mrs. Chen said with a laugh. "We're going to work you very hard. You have 8 years of missed opportunities to make up for." Dr. Harrison pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a text message. "This is from the Dean of Berkeley Conservatory. I sent him videos of your performance tonight. He wants to offer you a full scholarship to complete your degree, with a living stipends included." Sarah stared at the phone screen, unable to believe what she was reading. "But I'm 24 years old. I'm too old to be a student." "Music has no age limits," Mrs. Harrison said, joining the conversation. "Some of the greatest artists didn't begin their professional careers until their 30s or 40s. The evening continued with more introductions and more opportunities. A concert promoter wanted to book Sarah for a series of performances. A recording company representative was interested in discussing a contract. Music teachers offered to help her prepare for auditions. Sarah felt like she was living in a dream. That morning, She had been just another invisible waitress worried about paying bills. Now she was surrounded by people who wanted to help her become a professional musician. As the event finally wound down near midnight, Sarah found herself alone with Mrs. Wellington for a moment. "I still can't believe this is real," Sarah said. Mrs. Wellington smiled and squeezed Sarah's hand. "It's real, dear, and it's just the beginning. But I have to ask, when did you know you wanted to play tonight?" Sarah thought about the question. "I think I've wanted to play again every day for 8 years. But tonight when I saw Mr. Petrov collapse and heard how desperate you were, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The music inside me was too strong to keep locked away." "Thank goodness for that," Mrs. Wellington said. "You saved our evening, but more importantly, you saved yourself." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the stage at Carnegie Hall, wearing an elegant black concert dress instead of a waitress uniform. The program, in the audience members' hands, listed her as Sarah Martinez, piano soloist. In the front row sat her mother and Danny, who was looking much healthier thanks to the medical treatment his new insurance covered. Dr. Harrison sat in the third row with his wife, beaming with pride like a father watching his daughter graduate. Mrs. Chen and Judge Morrison were there too, along with Mrs. Wellington and dozens of other people who had become Sarah's supporters and friends. Before she began to play, Sarah looked out at the packed concert hall and thought about that night at the Grandview Hotel. She thought about how one moment of courage can change everything. She thought about dreams that seem dead but are only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. The orchestra behind her waited for her signal to begin Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The same piece she had played alone that magical night. But this time, she was not a waitress stealing a moment at someone else's piano. She was Sarah Martinez, professional pianist, sharing her gift with the world. As she raised her hands to begin playing, Sarah smiled. The music that had been trapped in her heart for so long was finally free, and this was only the beginning of the beautiful sound it would make. The little girl who had once dreamed of playing on stages like this had grown up, faced hardship, and found her way back to the music. Sometimes the longest journeys take you right back to where you started, but with a deeper understanding of why you needed to be there. Sarah's fingers touched the keys, and the music began to fill the great hall. In the audience, people wiped their eyes as they remembered their own dreams and felt inspired to believe in magic again. Music had the power to transform everything it touched, and Sarah's story would inspire countless other dreamers to never give up on the songs in their hearts. The fairy tale was real, and it was just beginning.